actually. So good morning once again, everyone. We are in block 1 and we will be discussing the 4th unit today. And this unit of ecology, environment and sustainability, we'll be discussing development and environment. I am Shalini Dhyani and I will be taking your today's class on development and environment. Now, this is the 4th section, the 4th unit of this block. And the structure of this unit says that we have to cover economic development and well-being of people. We will be covering economic growth, economic development, and how it is linked with welfare. We'll also be discussing environment and economic growth in detail. And for this, there are two important hypotheses that we will be again discussing. That will be, first one is resource curse hypothesis, and the second one is environmental Kuznets curve. Now, these are two important aspects of discussing sustainability with reference to economic development. We'll be also in the end taking the broader overview with the on the basis of the discussion that what actually and how actually economic development should look like and how environmental sustainability should shape up in the present era of Anthropocene. Now, what will be the expectation from you, especially all the scholars who are enrolled in this course? The first thing and the expectation with this chapter and this unit of this block is to understand the relationship between economic growth and environment. Second, you are able to analyze hypotheses that are related to economic growth, environment, and sustainable development. And you are capable to generalize the relationship between development and environment and the interrelationship and development, how development impacts environment, and how environment is able to facilitate economic development. And in the end, you are able to explain ecological economics of sustainable development. So these are few of the expectations. So expect that your questions in this chapter will also be, in this unit will be also related to these expectations. Now, I will expect that all those who have not unmuted their mics to please mute their mics, because the hindrance in between really disturbs to somebody who is speaking. So for this first slide, one thing is very clear, that sustainable development is a complex composition of people, planet, peace, partnership, and prosperity. So if we want to achieve all of them, and these are the major important aspects that we want to achieve through sustainable development. After the Brundtland Commission gave this concept and definition of sustainable development long back, this is how we have started thinking about sustainable development. And this links these major topics. May I again request to please, keep your mics on mute. May I request the administrator to please keep your mic in the mute so that it is easier for me to deliver this talk. Now, with this, it becomes very important to understand that the population, the growing population affects environment, and environment is capable to impact local population also, the individual, their life histories, their behavior and everything, how they perceive these changes. This all is going to facilitate sustainable development in the present time. Now, what can be the mediating factors? So we need to actually think about what can be the mediating factors when we talk about environment, economic development, and sustainable development. Now, one of the important mediating factors of sustainable development are, of course, economic development, the GDP, the gross domestic product of any national development, economic development. Then, of course, the policies and context, the legislature that influences. So that means right policies can help protect the environment. Right policies can also help to have a sustainable economic growth. Then, of course, science and technology, because New technologies can reduce impact on environment, can facilitate economic development without having a significant amount of destruction of the environment. Now, of course, cultural factors, because this is also one of the mediating factors or important drivers of environmental loss. And when I talk about population, the fertility of population, because fertility relates to rise in population. So the rise in population has to be related with the fertility of population, and we'll be discussing why it is so important, why population growth and how it relates with economic development. Of course, rate of mortality. If economic development is happening, there is welfare state, human well-being is there. So mortality is more or less reduced because economic development also takes care of human welfare and healthcare systems. And then, of course, this also relates and translates to migration. Migration is mostly the result of growth that is not leading to welfare of population, not leading to human well-being. Now, when I talk about the drivers and mediating factors for environment, land use, there are n number of direct and indirect drivers of environmental loss. This can be land use, land cover change, air quality, water quality, global warming, biodiversity loss. So you can think about all the planetary boundaries that we have discussed in our previous lecture. So these are some of the important mediating factors that you have to keep in mind when you talk about and when you discuss environment and economic development. Now, there are 2-3 important terminologies that I think you all should be aware about. So one thing is macroeconomics. So macroeconomics basically talks about the broader context, the broader area of development, of economic development. So your gross domestic product, understanding and trying to understand the gross natural product, the country level or larger level of demand and supply. What are the demand supply gaps? What are the consumption patterns? How governments are spending, where investments are happening, where trade-offs are happening, where net exports are happening, where net imports are happening. So overall, this context is being covered in macroeconomics. And there is another term called microeconomics. So in this particular area of economics, sub area of economics, we talk about individual markets, local markets. We talk about effect of a price of a good. We also talk about individual labor market, individual consumer behavior, and supply of goods. So that is very clear that at micro level and at individual market level, whatever we discuss comes into microeconomics, and macroeconomics is a more broader economic study of a larger area, of a larger country. So that is how we define them. And there is a new area now emerging, and that is macro ecological economics. So I will be discussing about this also in my forthcoming slide. Now, macroeconomics, as I mentioned, is study of the economy as a whole. It is the study of economy-wide phenomena. It includes national, regional, and global economics. So economics of climate change, economics of biodiversity loss. So this all can come and they are covered under this topic. Inflation because of COVID, inflation because of climate change, inflation because of war, they all are covered under macroeconomics. And they basically present you the bigger picture of economics. They also talk about national output, national income, unemployment, and so many other terms that on daily basis we keep seeing in media, and how the discussions happen about the broader impact of certain kind of development, certain kind of activity or certain kind of affair on the economic development. And this is, as I mentioned in previous slide, it's very much in contrast with the microeconomics that discusses the individual economics of a local area or an individual person. Now, macroeconomics in this chapter is all about economic growth and development, and it is considered as an aggregated concept that belongs to macroeconomics at a larger level. And it is also important to mention here that policy intervention at national level, at international level, and at regional level are very, very important to actually, they are very much linked to how there is societal inequity, how there is unemployment persisting, inflations, how there is inequity in payments, international trade, exchange rate. So this all is Somewhere there are a lot of policies, national and international policies, that regulate these macroeconomic concepts. Now, the major aim of this area of economics is to achieve economic growth, development, increasing the GDP. And it is also believed that there might be many other ways how this economic development can be measured. For example, if I want to see how economic development relates to something, I would like to see that how justice is there, how human justice is addressed in a society. Are there these societies are talking about equity? If there is opportunities and possibilities and facilities of education for all. So that's why even Indian government talks about, and many more government talks about education for all, be it rich or poor. Even those who are poor, they have right to education. So this is how economic development should actually look like. Then of course, nutrition. Nutritional security can be one of the important parameters of ensuring that economic development brings nutrition for all. And that's why if you try to relate to this concept with sustainable development goals, you will find that this entire development goal is related to welfare, human well-being, sanitation, safe water, fresh water, conserved ecosystem. And this all are basically one of the indicators of a good economic growth of any country. Now, in this case, GNP, the gross national product, has been taken as a measure of welfare. And it is said that countries who have high gross natural product per capita are basically the people, basically the countries that are enjoying better welfare, better benefits. Now, if I again give one of the examples how this branches of economics have evolved, while you see that microeconomics has been supported by neoclassical approaches of economics, developmental economics, environmental economics, behavioral economics, the psychological aspects, how people perceive development, the econometric, the mathematical part, and labor economics. So these are all parts of microeconomics, and they're covered under the umbrella of microeconomics. While macroeconomics talks about free market, you can relate to it with the voluntary markets of carbon credits, how carbon credits are sold in international markets, and most of these markets are international markets. Then your Keynesian markets, the Marxist approach, Austrian free market, mercantilism, the protectionism, and monetarist approach. So these are different approaches and branches of macroeconomics, and this is another area of deep economics that somebody would be interested. I brought this area for your awareness, so that you know that where and what are the branches and how they are and how they contribute to environment and ecological economics. Now, when we talk about gross natural product and GDP, we can say that it has not been designed basically to measure welfare. This is basically designed to measure the overall national development. For example, if you see the development in the country, you will find that our country is developing very fast. We are one of the fastest growing economies. But at the same time, we will like to say, and we will like to see if this one of the fastest growing economy is also translating to the welfare, the human well-being of each and every individual in one of the fastest growing population as well. So now in this case, GNP is mostly taken as a proxy for development. It is a proxy because maybe there is a lot of development happening at national level, but it might not be translated to per capita level. Maybe an individual living in a rural area might not be having that kind of accessibilities towards good education, good livelihood opportunities, good health, medical and healthcare. This is something where we can see that GNP is basically one of the proxies of development. And this is also because of a lot of neoclassical approaches of economics and GNP approach that is more or less as explicitly a utilitarian approach. And within this utilitarian philosophy, individual welfare, individual well-being of a person in the society, in the country, is a degree to which individuals can satisfy their desires with the help of as many goods and services they can buy. But at the same time, I would like to bring your attention to this, if your happiness, if your psychological benefits can be traded in the market. Sometimes a person living in mountain area might be more satisfied because he might not have cash economy to buy everything that is available in the market. And at the same time, market supplies will not be very organized, but he has this subsistence requirement that can be very much fulfilled by the nature and natural resources around them. So it has been accepted that the goal of society is to basically provide maximum amount of utility for its citizens. So this is how GNP progresses. This is how GNP takes welfare of citizens. Higher per capita output is also expected to satisfy more and more of the desires and provide greater utility. But at the same time, this becomes also wrong in many ways. It is not always true that higher per capita output is going to satisfy most of our demands and give us a better well-being. How and why, I'll be discussing it in my in forthcoming slides. Now, over a period of time, what has been observed that the developmental approach needs to be modified. But still, if you see globally, GDP and GNP are the benchmarks, are the key ways how we assess the progress of economic development of any country. Now, these are two important Nobel laureates in economy, Dr. Amartya Sen and Dr. Martha Nussbaum, who talked about going beyond GNP, going beyond GDP. And these are the developmental economists who talked about the indicators that measure distribution of income and quality of life. So quality of life coming from biodiversity, coming from ecosystem health is something that has been considered one of the prime areas of research of ecological economics. Now, health, good health, improved life expectancy, educational achievement, this all has been added to the list of developmental indicators. Education for all, good health for all, improving life expectancy, gender equality, these are all some of the key areas. And there are so many of indices they are being proposed and developed, including Human Development Index, that has been now used as an approach for developing the progress, developing the economic upliftment, economic development, and so on and so forth. Now, approach that uses and values human actions independently of their outcomes can be considered or can be termed human development approach to welfare, as opposed to the utilitarian approach of the neoclassical economists. And as I mentioned, Martha and Amartya Sen have been two important supporters of these kind of philosophies. And Professor Amartya Sen has also tried to advocate important reforms and realms of primary education and primary healthcare. Now, if you see these other economists who have worked in and got Nobel Prize in recent years, they have talked a lot about poverty. They have talked a lot about education and healthcare and how improving these basic welfare and well-being requirements can help countries develop in a better way. Now, all these neoclassical economists have argued that capabilities and functionings are very, very critical for human well-being. And when I talk about functioning, it is basically human achievements for achieving good quality of life and the one which is cherished by them. So capabilities include both states of being and opportunities for doing. So if you have opportunities for taking a better livelihood opportunities for good education, opportunities for good health and well-being. So these are some of the important areas that have been considered very vital and critical for developing a new approach, a new human development index. Now, this is in basic very different to the utilitarian theory that says that if wages are increasing, human welfare will also increase. Now, this is not true in many cases. So now, while one of these approach of utilitarian theory says that if one option is available, one option out of many is available to us, we can choose one option from many of these uh, available options. And availability of number of option is basically not a consequence to welfare, but the final choice is indicated by the market price is the welfare of is the measure of that is called as human well-being. Now this is also mentioned that human development approach is less concerned with actual choices of people, makes them with the options they have and the freedom to choose from. So it is important that people should have options, and people should also have freedom to choose their options from these multiple actual options that are available to them. So marketplace is only one of many spheres in which choice is important. So that's why in market you can have choice to buy what is accessible to you. Maybe even if you like to compare it with some of these supplements that are given for good health, you will find the similar kind of calcium tablet is available at a low price, whereas there is also choice of higher priced calcium tablets in the options actually gives you opportunity to choose the best one that is more accessible to you and that is more accessible as per the wages paid to you. Now, these two theories of neoclassical economics and utilitarian theory says that there is a common objection to this concept of market and market choices as it is concerned, and it is said that it's insensitivity to consider distributive issues. It has also been debated and argued that if what it is to be maximize the greatest happiness, then it matters little whether that happiness is shared by a few while many suffer or equally among all. So the neoclassical economics and the utilitarian was talking more about, uh, uh, I mean, if you see the even the current, how this current society works, there are certain number of people who are rich, and these riches are getting richer. Whereas if you see the poor people, where while the GDP of the country and the GNP of the country is rising, there is still a huge disparity among who holds this maximum share of economy. Now, economic growth, economic development, and economic welfare, these are important concerns of the society. So economic welfare can come in terms of real income, job satisfaction. We always say that we might get a job, but job satisfaction is something really tough to get in present circumstances. Prospects of the employment that we are doing, leisure time, uh, for economic welfare and getting high wages. It is also not true that we do the hard work, earn this income by toiling out hard throughout the day, 7 days a week or 6 days a week. It is important we have sufficient time, leisure time to enjoy this economic welfare. Our environment and air pollution is also there. Air pollution reduction is also there because we have good amount of money. We are economically stable, have that access to the market to buy whatever we want to do. But at the same time, if our environment is polluted, we cannot say that we have an economic welfare state. What are our happiness levels? If you compare it with the country of Bhutan, it is considered one of the top ranking countries in happiness index. You know that economics is not something that gives you direct happiness. There is many more things. Living in an environment that is pollution free, living in an environment that supports your human and psychological health and well-being. So these all things are considered important for your economic welfare. Then of course, life expectancy. If you have happiness, if you are living in stress-free, less polluted or not polluted environment, if you have time to give to your family and have your own me time or leisure time, of course your healthcare benefits are more. You will spend less money to doctors and improve your life expectancy. You have good access to good kind of education. Your cost of living might also, I mean, it should not be very high. Your cost of living is also one of the parameters, one of the indicators of economic welfare. And of course, housing, not anywhere, housing in an area that is good, that has good ambient. And that's why now you see that there is a suddenly bloom in urban areas where market prices of such flats and housing society is very high, where environment is clean, where we have good ambience, we have good trees. So that becomes one of the criteria of human well-being. Now, there has been another term that is discussed is measure of economic welfare, or that is called as MEW. Early on finding the GNP, it was, of course, and it is still an inadequate measure of development. While some economists have developed a direct index of welfare and they have considered it as measured economic welfare, and this was tested in early between 1929 to 65 in USA. And what observations, what results were found were that during this period, GNP and measure of economic welfare were indeed positively correlated. In the early phase, when industrial development was also happening, it also translated into measure of economic welfare. Welfare was also very much related to it. For every 6 units of increase in GNP, there was an average, a 4-unit increase in measure of economic welfare that was observed during this period in USA. But later on, after almost 20 years, two of the economists, Daly and Cobb, actually revisited this issue and actually thought that the concept of measure of economic welfare is also not appropriate, not true. And that is how he developed an index of sustainable economic welfare. So he replaced, he took this measure of economic welfare to the next level by introducing the index of sustainable economic welfare. Now, during this process, they found that it only takes about 18 years of time, and it took almost 18 years of time in USA, right from 1947 to 65. That positive correlation that was observed in the early 20 years, like there was this 16 point, there was this 6 unit of increase in GNP, and there was on an average 4 unit of increase in MEW, measure of economic welfare. He found that in later years, the positive correlation between them actually was disturbed. So what was the reason why it was disturbed? We'll be discussing about them. And they also discussed that welfare measured in terms of economic growth is not going to reflect the living standards of people, especially in the developing countries. You can relate it with a lot of countries, especially the developing countries like India and all other neighboring countries in South Asia. You will find that basically it is not true for everybody, where economic growth is directly translating to living standards of people. There are always inequalities, and these inequalities grow as income starts getting higher. So this is very clear in the society we live, where people with low income have higher population, whereas high income people have low population. You have also read this during the pandemic time, millionaires turned billionaires. So there was a continuous rise in people who were rich, getting more rich, whereas people, those who were not rich, who were middle class or below middle class, their income opportunities, their livelihood opportunities fall, and that is why there was a larger group of people who were of low income or who started belonging to low income group. So this more recent data on income equality shows that after 1990, there was increase in widening of the economic equality. And this was also the time when economic development in the world was very fast. So this widening of inequality also translates into reduction in welfare. So while it was said that GNP is proportional to MEW more or less almost, but this shows that after a certain time when economic development takes place, money is, or economy is with a group of or a few hundreds of people, whereas the larger population is still away from welfare. And the statistical evidence over the year also shows that many countries have basically diverged between welfare and economic growth. So there is a divergence, and one of the major criteria and indicators of this is the degradation of environment that reduces this welfare. The higher the development, of course, it is on the cost of the environment, it is on the cost of the resources and bioresources. So once our resources are reducing, it also reduces the welfare. And that's why over the period of time, the gross national product growth is basically less relevant as a welfare indicator as it was a century before. Now, this is also clear that the index of sustainable economic welfare that was created for United States of America after 1965, that includes environmental cost for distributional changes, and it also includes leisure time. Now, these are the two important parameters that have been included, that for every development that is happening, every economic growth that is happening, there is a hidden and certain and relevant environmental cost. That is the very inherent part of index of sustainable economic welfare. Now, ISEW was positively correlated with GNP up to around 1980. After that, it was observed, if you see this, you will find that it also started turning slightly negative. So this is two of the important welfare indexes. One was a measure of economic welfare that was introduced in early 1920s, and then there was this another one that was index of sustainable economic welfare that you need to consider, that these are two important ones. And it was also observed that valuation of resources and deciding how much is to be used now and how much has to be left for next generation. Now, this was an important definition how Brundtland Commission coined the term of sustainable development, that you can only utilize up to a limit so that you have sufficient amount left for the forthcoming generation. Now, how much it should be used and how much has to be left for the next generation is indeed a very tough question to be addressed. If we talk about sustainable use of wild species, every specific extraction from plant, every hunting of animal for personal consumptions, and of course, timber and also marine areas, every species has its own thresholds. Every species has its own sustainable use limit. So that needs to be well understood and decided. Now, when we put money values, when we put monetary values to these terms and these sustainable use practices, this is something that becomes a very irrational and erroneous approach to sustainable development. And that is why we need to understand, and that is why ecological economics was introduced as a different subject in economics, because it doesn't work in the typical classical approaches of economics. And monetary values for a given resource vary depending on the amount of the resource is used. How much of the resource is used, monetary values are given based on that. For example, if you talk about the price of fossil fuels in the market, it not only depends upon the current rates of extraction of oil, technology used, but it also depends upon what is the availability of oil in the market. We all know that the resources are to be depleted in coming decades. So that also raises the price of this important resource to run our economy. And we know that coal and fossil fuels are two of the important resources of economic development. So using prices that are determined by resource use in current period to decide the approximate amount of a resource is always and most of the time questioned. Hence, it is seen that economic growth, it is always talked that if there is more development happening, more economic growth happening, there are chances and there are sure chances that it is coming on the cost of the environment, on the cost of the air quality, on the cost of the water quality, on the cost of the forest that we have. So it is coming on, all the inherent costs are basically hidden with the environment. And there has been a lot of interest, obviously, to understand this crucial relationship between environment and economic growth. And that has been proxy for the development. And if you see the industrial revolution, most of these development has taken place on the cost of coal and fossil fuel. And in international comparisons, we usually lack time series data. We don't have temporal data to understand welfare indices in many countries. For example, we may have data for a decade, but we don't have data for last 2 to 3 to 4 decades to understand how economic growth, how environmental loss is correlated. That is one of the drawbacks and one of the limitations of economic growth and welfare indices, understanding how this is dependent or interdependent on each other. Now, there are several controversial hypotheses that were put forward in this period by economists, and there was a lot of evidence also produced in the favor of these hypotheses as well as against it. So these are important turning points. For example, when economic development starts taking place, environment also starts degrading, and there is a time in per capita income and how development and economic development takes place that comes on the cost of environment. The turning point is the peak point, from where economic development starts reducing. And when your economic development starts reducing, this is also the time where basically your pressure on the resources, your concern of environmental extraction reduces, and that improves environment. Now there is this another hypothesis that is I will be talking about how pre-industrial economies were talking about this destruction, how industrial economies were talking about this turning point, and how post-industrial revolution, the service sector-based economy is taking environment as an important parameter, as an important context of GDP per capita. Now, when we talk about environmental sustainability, it is very clear that it comes from certain aspects of decisions that governments are taking, that international governments are deciding, that are having a consensus. Sometimes they are having consensus, but they don't have commitments. So the first and important one, if you can relate it with the current climate politics happening, this means that we need to shift to renewable resources. If you see the Glasgow COP promises by Prime Minister last year, it shows and it says that India has already committed that we will be net zero by 2070. So that means that we will have a significant shift to renewable sources by 2070. Our present energy demands that is fulfilling and that are channelizing to be used as developmental growth in this country are coming from coal. So that means, and right now we have about 61% of our dependence from coal, whereas 40% are coming from other resources. And these are more renewable sources. So that means we have to shift from coal to more renewable green sources of energy. And we have also to ensure that our consumption is limited of non-renewable sources. That's why there is a shift in policies now. Even if you see to reduce vehicular emission, there is a certain criteria that by a certain time period you have to get rid of the car, so that only efficient cars are on the roads, and that ensure that there is less emission happening. Then protection of health of ecosystems, your convention of biodiversity, your national biodiversity action plans, they all are working for protection of ecosystems. Avoiding excess pollution, again, so many policies, so many government discussions are happening. Intergenerational decision. Now it is important that we don't rely on only senior leaders. It is important that young people are also mainstreamed in decision making, because they are the ones who have to live in these futures. So intergenerational decision making, youth mainstreaming in decision making is something that will have a long-term impact and a positive impact. And target welfare, not GDP. If we target that, we will ensure human welfare, human well-being instead of economic development. This is something that can ensure environmental sustainability. Now, in this context, there are two important hypotheses that we'll be testing, and we'll be discussing a bit about that. One such controversy is about resource curse hypothesis. So one of the hypotheses is resource curse hypothesis, and we'll be discussing this. This says that natural resource abundance does not necessarily result in high economic growth. And I will discuss a very interesting example of Africa. You know that Africa is having one of the richest ecosystems. You have Latin America, you also have Asia, but at the same time, this rich resource areas, abundant resource areas does not actually result in high economic growth. And the second controversial hypothesis, so first one was resource curve, second one is environmental Kuznets curve. And this is the inverted U-shaped relation that is between per capita income and environmental variables. And this indicates that initial levels of development, environmental degradation increases, but up to a certain level. Beyond that, it starts declining. Both these hypotheses, resource curves and environmental Kuznets, are limited to certain situations. They have their own plus point, their own negative point, and they work well for a certain period of time in the history. How I will be discussing, and they can also not be generalized for all nations in the world. There are certain countries who have judiciously, really rationally use their resources for development. But at the same time, it is important to know about these two important hypotheses. First one is resource curse hypothesis. So are rich natural resources across the world blessing or a curse? Are they of good use to people who are using them? So while this is necessary for economic prosperity, we have evidences that natural resource abundant economy grow at a slower pace if the economy depends excessively on natural resource consumption. It also says that natural resources are abundant world over. The prices of primary products are lower than the manufactured products, and terms of trade are normally against the primary product. So now a very good example can be cocoa production. You know that cocoa, the chocolate, it comes from Africa. And if you know the people who actually harvest and grow cocoa, make this in a usable form of chocolate, are the ones who get the lowest wages. They are the people who are living in more conditions that are not very much as we were talking about human welfare. But at the same time, so this primary product doesn't have a market. It doesn't have a proper, they don't get enough of prices for this. But the moment it is value added by these national companies, these, for example, they convert into a better chocolate product. And these manufactured products are having high price. And that's why these industries, these companies are billions of dollars of industry. At the same time, people who are doing this practice in resource rich areas are the people who are still poorest. Same is the story of tea gardening, same is the story of coffee producers. And this is very much relates with resource curse hypothesis. Now, as the resource gets scarce, the prices go up. But again, the people who are using and producing and extracting primary produce are not the ones who are getting the best benefits, best welfare out of this market. And terms of trade turn in favor of these resources. For example, in the case of oil. So while I discussed one story of cocoa, there is this another story of fossil fuels. So the moment resources starts drying up, the prices starts blooming up. This is the resource curse hypothesis. So that says that if there are less resources or no resources, people pay taxes to the government, and these expenditures are basically for welfare of people. And at the same time, because people are paying taxes for the welfare, they want to scrutinize the spending, how and where these spendings are scrutinized. For example, we keep asking, and you see in media, they keep asking the public money going in different ways, public money going the lavish lifestyle of politicians. So these are some of the questions that citizens have the right to ask because they are paying taxes. Whereas in resource rich areas, extractive industries are basically paying taxes to the government. If you see these multi-million dollar companies coming, for example, you can take the example of PepsiCo and Coca-Cola, who are using the natural groundwater for making these cold drinks, and they pay taxes to the government. And these expenditures are, you're not sure if these expenditures are basically for human welfare or not, because you never know where this money is going. So in this case, citizens don't have an idea and they are less prone to monitor government spending. So in most democratic conditions, when people are paying taxes, for example, might not true for India and other developing countries, but developed economies like Australia and US, where taxes are high, at the same time, people get a lot for their benefits, a lot for their welfare in terms of their retirement plan, in terms of their medical and health care, and they always try and ask questions to scrutinize the spending. So now this is another way of showing this, how natural resource depletion leads to economic disruption, institutional failure, conflict. So of course, if there are a lot of natural resources, this also leads to a lot of conflicts because of feasibility, because of the greed, because of the grievances. There might also be institutional failure because of low accountability, less representation of people, non-democratic conditions, and also economic disruptions. Of course, if economic disruptions are there, a lot of other issues are also related to that, leads to growth and failure. So economic development reduces or halts. Now, there comes another question that was asked by one of the economists, Jonathan D. John, and he asked, is there really a resource curse? Are there implications for governance and production? So we know that resource curse leads to poor economic performance, high levels of corruption, and greater political violence as well. So this is one of the conditions that has been faced in many countries of Africa. We now also see in some other parts, even in Latin America. And contrary to earlier arguments that mineral abundance can help overcome traditional resource gap, it says that resource curse theory is applied to all natural resource abundant economies, not just in sub-Saharan Africa. So there are a lot of examples across the world where a lot of resource-rich conditions have led to poor economic performance, high level of corruption, and also greater political violence. And there are some of very burning examples that we can find. Africa is one of them, where other countries, especially developed countries, have come, digged up their resources, used these resources to build up their economies, while Africa didn't got anything. And if you see the earlier times in Africa, where a lot of countries were colonized, and even in the case of India, a lot of this colonialism, colonial period brought a lot of resource extraction. Our lot of forests were extracted, our lot of coal was extracted to support industrial revolution. The countries that manage their wealth better would benefit. This is very right. And at the same time, past experience of the countries that are dependent on natural resource wealth was and has not been very encouraging. Now, there are countries, where this resource curse situation was faced. For example, Russia, Nigeria, Venezuela experienced growth of lower magnitude despite of having very rich resources. And then there are countries that, can you please switch off your microphone, Roshan? Please switch off your microphone. Then there are countries that base their economies on natural resource, tend to be examples of developmental failure. Now, there are also countries who have very limited resources, but they have very judiciously planned to maximize benefits of these resources. For example, Japan, Hong Kong, Korea, you see the way they have planned. They have planted their forest back to ensure that they have sustained supply of benefits. Singapore, Switzerland, and they are one of the fastest and biggest economies in the world just because of judicious use of their resources and management. Whereas some countries that are rich in oil reserve, for example, many countries in the Middle East, or countries that are rich in tropical forest, example, Brazil, use them for timber production has been comparatively less prosperous. There are so many such examples. However, we cannot say 100%, but there are always exceptions. So in this case, exceptions are also there. Now, there is another approach of resource rent that is used for construction of road, modernization of telecommunication, health and education programs to achieve greater growth rates. Now, several countries have benefited from natural wealth and they have used this resource rent for actual welfare of human well-being. And if you see, the examples are in Latin America, where in 19th century resource bloom related to and stimulated economic progress in the continent. And then, of course, the biggest example of Great Britain and Germany, where a lot of development happened because of the vast deposits of ore and coal, and also because of the colonization approach, where colonial approach led to support whatever resources were in these countries to support industrial revolution of Great Britain. And a more recent example can be taken of Norway, a country that has managed its resource abundance condition well and has converted it into economic prosperity. Now, another thing is Iceland, that has experienced sustained growth. Now, these are some of the examples that can be considered very important when you talk about resource rent conditions. Now, there was this another study that was carried out in by a logarithm of 38 countries, logarithm of income per capita of 38 countries in 1975, to understand natural resource abundance and how it can show a positive or negative relationship between economic growth. And it was found that the relationship between resource richness and GDP growth has been limited to specific period. It cannot be generalized. And if you see these examples in India, the mountain states of India, Northeast, then Western Himalayas, Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, and so on and so forth. So many of these northeastern states, we have, they are so resource rich, but at the same time that doesn't translate into the economic growth. Again, Himachal Pradesh has been one of the exceptions where judicious planning, appropriate use of natural resources, and promoting right policies at the right time has facilitated a growth. Now, so it cannot be generalized, and at the same time, there can be both the situations where right choices and right practices can make the entire difference. The study also found that natural resource well-dependent economies may stimulate growth, but this stimulation comes under certain conditions. So what are those enabling conditions that ensure effectiveness of this development is basically the policies, right choices, right practices that make all the difference. But still the factor remains that most of the countries that depend on their primary resources are basically developing countries. And at the same time, these are also the same countries where there is crucial problem of corruption, low investment, deterioration in terms of trade, unsustainable harvesting, low education, illiteracy, that will probably not benefit from its natural health due to adverse indirect impact. So the first thing is we understand the drivers of law and how these drivers can and how these gaps can be filled. And there are several causes for their underperformance. So I mentioned a few, but there might be many more such drivers of underperformance. And there are empirical studies that have said that natural resource wealth increases growth. And if negative indirect effects are excluded, natural resources are able to improve economic development in the country. Now, if you see the literature on natural resource and conflict and main schools of thought, we have three important schools of thought: the new classical economics that we discussed, the new Malthusianism theories and school of thought, and political ecology. While new classical says that abundance increases the risk of conflict and gave resource curves hypothesis, neo-Malthusianism says that scarcity increases the risk of conflict. So in all these cases, in one case, abundance risk increases the risk of conflict. In second case, scarcity increases the risk of conflict. And political ecology says that inequality increases the risk of conflict. So mechanism is for neo-Malthus school of thought: competition over scarce resources, deprivation, migration, state failure. These are on the important mechanism. And inequality to excess resources and scarcity as a product of society. These are important tasks. Now, environmental Kuznets curve says that the environment, that economic development initially leads to deterioration in the environment that we discussed here in the previous, that economic development leads to environmental degradation. But after a certain level of economic growth, a society begins to improve its relationship because your education improves, your way how you see environment, that awareness also improves. And this relation, society begins to improve its relationship with the environment, and hence that is how environmental degradation also reduces. So if your economical development leads to human welfare, that includes better education, right education, and better awareness, this can lead to reduced environmental degradation. And from a very simplistic viewpoint, it can be suggested that economic growth is basically good for the environment. From simplistic viewpoint, we can say, and that's why now, even if you see wherever developmental projects are coming, government asks corporates some corporate social responsibility, corporate ecological responsibility. So while they do development, they also have to ensure that ecosystem and social responsibility is at risk. Now, critics also argue that there is no guarantee that economic growth will lead to an improved environment. And in many conditions, we know that many corporates basically not do actual conservation, they mimic conservation. And at the least, it requires a very targeted policy and attitudes to make sure that economic growth is compatible with an improved environment. So that means that government has to be aware, they have to have that commitment, they have to have that understanding that policies are in such a way that ensure that economic growth, whatever is happening, is compatible with an improving environment. And that's why government ensures that so many of these environmental conditions are the prime importance along with environmental development, ecosystem development. Now, causes of these environmental Kuznets curve says there are empirical evidence that with economic growth, there will be decline in population. When people get more aware, they have good access, their approach and the way to think life, and with better understanding about life expectancy, the population also, population level decreases. And there are examples from Japan, European countries, and USA, where economic growth has resulted in decline in population level. And similar is true with reference to our country, where present generation, where population, if you see the level of rise in population, is comparatively lesser than previous generations. Then people spare income with growth, and people are more amenable to pay higher prices in return for better environmental standards. Now you see, there are more ethical products in the market. There are more products, and of course they have this niche market, but at the same time, people are there who want to pay for environment. And then people focus on living standards than real GDP. So that is the kind of awareness that is brought by economic development. Improved technology, improvement in technology to reduce how we degrade environment. For example, the way we are doing coal mining, or how we are using this. So the primary driving force is improved because of technology and higher productivity. With higher productivity, we can see higher output with less raw material. So that is the efficiency that is brought by these improved technologies. And now the causes are also solar. There is a shift with environmental and economic development that we want to shift to more cleaner source of energy. We're also towards deindustrialization, where you see that economic development leads to more farming to manufacturing. This leads to greater environmental degradation. However, when productivity increases and real income, there is a third shift from industrial to the service sector. A role of government regulation. There is indeed a government regulation, and government imposes tax and penalties to ensure that environmental externalities which are harming health and living standards are regulated and reduced. And then diminishing margin utility of income, and having a very high salary right now, many times it's not very high in the terms. So for high salaries, you might have to sit in bigger cities, the metropolitans with congestion, pollution, these are also prime reasons to deter you from being in bigger cities. So these are some of the causes. And if I look to and discuss a bit on criticism, there are mixed evidences to this. And is also said that no guarantee that economic growth will see a decline in pollutants. Again, this is another school of thought. And pollution is not simply a function of income, it is also because of effectiveness, how government policies are framed, how enforcement is taking place, how penalties are given, how population is rising. These all are leading to the product of pollution. And then, of course, global pollution. For example, if you see transboundary pollution, pollution in one country might affect pollution in other country. The forest fires in Borneo and Sumatra can affect countries like Singapore. So despite being a clean country, there are another ways and means to actually get pollution. So global pollution is one of the contexts and concerns. And then growth leads to greater resource use. We know that if you see the carbon emissions that are happening in USA and European countries, you will know that growth leads to more resource use. But if economy continues to expand, then inevitably some resource will continue to be used in greater measure. So one thing is carbon, carbon dioxide, and energy and fossil fuels. So this is one of the criticisms of Kuznets environmental curve. Now, this is also said that countries with highest GDP with highest level of carbon dioxide emission. I don't need to add on that because this is very clear, and I have been discussing this in most of my lectures, how carbon dioxide emissions have become one of the important concerns of high GDP. Now, some more criticisms are that relation has been found for only a few pollutants, but does not include deforestation. We talk about carbon dioxide emission, but we don't talk about other pollutants. And also like deforestation, we don't talk about arsenic and fluoride, that arsenic is more of a geogenic contaminant. So you cannot say that Kuznets curve is true for all pollutants. And past historical technological growth may not justify the same claims with same drum that are going to continue in future. In fact, the pace of technological progress may also decrease in future. That is also because everything has a threshold. Beyond that threshold, there are decreases and declines that are expected. And neoclassical approach also denies the impact of biosphere of an infinitely growing human economy. There is, again, as I mentioned, there is a certain barrier, there is a certain threshold. So human economy may grow, but it has to grow in its own ecological boundaries. It cannot go beyond ecological boundaries. So these are some of the criticisms that are true. And then there is a link between level of income and environmental degradation, and it's quite weak. It is also possible that economic growth will be compatible with the improved environment. So if your environment is clean, maybe the human welfare in better stage and your economic growth will be also better. But then again, the major driver of these entire economic growth is basically better policies, green policies, better enforcement, willingness of corporates to produce green energy and goods that are more environmental friendly. So this is one of the last topics I will be taking next few minutes to just complete this section. So when you talk about economic development and environmental sustainability in context of macroeconomies, that occupies growth and ecological economic challenges the standard emphasis on growth. While growth is a panacea, is rapidly now becoming today's affliction. And it was thought that most of the solutions of macroeconomic problems like overpopulation, inequitable distribution, unemployment, and poverty are also because of environmental degradation. And because economic development stands on environmental degradation, it has become one of the issues of current Anthropocene. So if macroeconomy can be conceived as part of the system and not the whole system, the logic of its microeconomic optimization applies to macroeconomics as well. I would like to know what is the optimal scale beyond which economic subsistence will not grow. As a student, you might also like to know. So it also shows that once it becomes uneconomic, and when I say uneconomic means when it passes its requirement that are available in the environment, if degradation is severe, the economic development should be stopped. Development that is coming on the cost of our rich resources, our forest, our water energy, our threatened ecosystem, it must stop. And that is how, if you relate with the situation of ozone hole, the development that was coming on the cost of ozone hole was stopped. Your chlorofluorocarbon that were coming from ACs and refrigerators, that manufacturing has to be shifted to some other form. So that is one of the examples that whenever practices become uneconomic, they have to be stopped. And it is the job of ecological economists and environmental economists to think and put up a point when the world is reaching optimal scale, and how do we actually return if accidentally we surpass it. For example, this is true with ozone layer. This is also true with how climate change economics and climate change discussions are happening. So we know we are somewhere pushing towards threshold. We know that we might in next 7 to 8 years we will accidentally surpass it. The best thing is we make that measures now so that we are under control. Now there is this another opinion approach on IP80, and what it is I will be discussing. And it discusses environmental issues. It discusses current projections about human population growth, economic growth, and technology. And it talks about technological realists about climate change and so many other environmental problems. So basically, as I mentioned, it is an opinion, a tautology, and very useful. It talks about the proximate determinant of environmental economics of impacts of economic activity. It does not tell us about fundamental or underlying determinant, but it does talk about environmental impacts of economic activity. So this talks about sustainable development, and it also talks about better in terms of satisfying the needs and desires of the world of people without impairing or harming resource depletion and environmental damage, and the ability to do so in the future. So sustainable development is basically a requirement for investment and technical change, as well as measure to protect the natural environment. And it involves dealing with the situations of uncertainty, ignorance, and irreversible actions. So this is very important. IP80 is very important if you talk about sustainable development, how it should be, how it should look like, and how it should be implemented, and what should be considered. Now, IP80 is basically I stand for impact on the environment. P is your population. A is activity per person or affluence. T is technology impact per activity. And impact on the environment is basically the resultant of population, activity per person, and technology, a cumulative impact of all three of them. So how many of us are there in, and are we beyond the carrying capacity or within the carrying capacity of environment? How much of activity we are doing? What kind of environmentally destructing activities or stuff that can hamper environment? And this basically assumes in affluence, how much of consumption is taking place. So this stands on the concept of social justice, technology, consumption, and population. So as I mentioned, IP80 is total impact based on population, affluence, and technology, and is one of the most simplified factors that can lead to environmental damage. Now, as I mentioned, if all else being equal, more people will have a greater impact on the people. If population rise happens, they will have more impact on the environment. And if there is affluence, more affluent society is, they will again have greater impact on the environment. But affluent societies can, of course, also have this opportunity to mitigate their impact. So this is some of these important aspects that we need to keep in mind. So when I say IP80, there are so many things, and because IP80 leads to sustainability, sustainable development, there are gender equality concerns, there is literacy concern, birth rate concerns, spirituality, ethics, art, policy, non-sustainable development that becomes a very core part of IPAT concept of sustainable development. So IPAT can also be considered emissions because they damage the environment. They talk about people, they talk about and consumption and emissions because of consumption. Now, if I give you an example of IPAT and climate change, it says that gross domestic product measures countries' economic output, but at the same time, it impacts and it leads to more carbon dioxide and GHG emissions. Now, there was this important economist, Herman Daly, who talked about beyond this. He talked about economics for the full world, how human economy influences mass balance theory that we discussed in previous lecture, and how these thermodynamic concepts are so important. He talked about renewable sources of your biotic system, and how their the impact on harvesting should be below the population growth rate of the renewable sources. For degradable pollutants, he talked about establishing assimilative capacities for receiving ecosystems and maintaining waste discharge below these levels. There is no rule for cumulative pollutants. Hence, discharge needs to be close to zero. So this is what he discussed. And for non-renewable sources, he talked about receipts from extraction that should be divided into income stream and investment stream. So the investment stream should be invested in the renewable business so that by the end of economic extraction, renewable substitute is available for all. He also talked about macroeconomic scale that has to be controlled. So the GDP, the growth has to be controlled. He also talked about minimizing the matter energy throughput in the economy, because you know that from the previous lecture, the entropy that comes in the lower entropy, by the end, because of waste and assimilation, it leads to higher entropy stage. So it is also fairly clever, when I am concluding in my slides, that emphasis of sustainable development is equity rather than efficiency. And economic efficiency is use of less resource per unit for human satisfaction with better technology that can help sustainable development. Efficient use of natural resources can help improve the prospect of sustainable development. But at the same time, if you remember the resource curse, it does not guarantee the same. Sustainable development is the requirement of many generations to manage the resources in a way that quality of life that we ensure ourselves cannot and is not denied for the future generation. So while we protect and we use resources for our betterment, the aspirations of future generations are also at risk. And both intra-generational and intergenerational equity is well addressed, because that's what the core context, the core backbone of sustainable development. And there was this common and pairings model that is a popular one in sustainable development approach, because it combines the ecological concept of stability with the economic efficiency. It talks about all these important parameters, but the most important context of this common and pairings model is ecological resilience, the capacity of the ecosystem to withstand ecological shocks. And that's why in present context, we always talk about environmental resilience. We always talk about societal resilience, that despite all shocks, development should be in such a way that it reduces these external shocks and and can come back to this original condition when external shocks are reduced. Hence, protection of ecological sustainability becomes very important for protecting ecosystem resilience. So this is another one, Hardwick-Solo's rule, that talks about the amount a society must save and reinvest to maintain the capital intact. The total capital stock in natural plus manufacture must not be non-declining. So that means we should have a development in such a way that whatever we are harvesting, whatever we are utilizing, doesn't lead to shortage and shrinking of resources in the wild. So that means some kind of sustainable approach to harvesting and development should be very much in place. And he said that weak sustainability is a criteria and a condition where development is sustainable so long as entire aggregate capital stocks are maintained at constant level. but somewhere it should be like it should not be constant. It should be in a way that much more stocks are available for future generation. So the bottlenecks of Hartwig rule are that growth can be sustained indefinitely if we take the resource rent and invest it in new produced capital, and that's not true. And doing this will ensure that total capital will remain at the same level. We don't dip into the principal. Even though we drop down natural capital, it is replaced by new investments in produced capital. So these are some of the important bottlenecks of Hardwick's rule. So the model of sustainability basically talks about optimal sustainable path that talks about marginal benefit for a reduction in value of resource growth that grows at an equal rate to the discount rate. Ecological sustainability reduces the desirability of economic growth in that along an optimal and sustained path. So any undesirable impact on ecosystem resilience must be deducted from pure economic benefit. And as Delhi mentioned, we say that throughput is the flow of raw material. So we have to ensure that our entropy is conserved. We don't rise to a area or context where high entropy waste are generated, and that leads to reduced carrying capacity of environment. He also talked about preserving ecological sustainability that requires managing ecological interactions with environment in such a way that economic doesn't interfere with the system resilience. And we have ecosystem resilience, and when it breaks down, it is not possible to have a sustained economic growth for long term. And he also talks about the resilience context, because resilience is important in this entire discussion as an important increasing function of biodiversity, ecosystem health, and preserving biodiversity that is very vital to ecological sustainability. So all in all, we kind of need a circular approach. We refuse, reduce, recycle the things and benefits that are coming from nature in such a way that they do not threaten the stability of system, and a consumer interest should not threaten the general system. So the consumeristic approach to environment should also be addressed and well understood and taken in a very sustainable manner. And that is the time when we can get welfare of the future generation and intertemporal equality. Now, if we like to very quickly summarize what we discussed economic growth and economic development, but both of them are not the same thing. We also talked about economists use economic growth as proxy. We also talked that since 90s all over the world, economic growth no longer reflects the welfare of people or sustainability. We also took a few hypotheses about economic growth to environment. And we also talked about environment Kuznets hypothesis that says economic growth leads to environmental degradation in this initial state. But as country develops, the willingness to pay for clean environment improves. And the last few points, environmental sustainability gets affected with economic activity. Hence, realization that both are important can lead to concept of sustainable development. We also discussed that previous economists looked to the rate of extraction of resources and advocated for a steady state, whereas non-declining consumption and capital stock are maintained period after period. At the later course of economists after 1925-50s have actually evolved by the sustainable development model that should result in economic efficiency and ecological sustainability. That is the core, and that is jointly interdependent on each other. And it was also realized that prices no longer reflect sustainable level of extraction. They are only market, they only reflect a market. So sustainable level of extraction and sustainable development goes beyond the boundaries of market. And last but not the least, economic activity should not disturb stability and resilience of ecosystem are some of the important aspects of this unit. And intergenerational equity is something that should be in the very core of this entire discussion. And with this, I am at the end, and I thank you for your patience to hear to these thoughts. In case you have any specific comments or questions, I'd like to answer. If you don't have any at this point, I will request to you to write to your course coordinator so that they can pass on